happens when a millionaire is forced to live with a woman who has nothing but her art? A clash of worlds, a fight for identity, and a love story that will leave you breathless. Watch as secrets unfold, passions ignite, and two people must decide if they're willing to risk everything for love and truth. Can they overcome the betrayal, or will their worlds tear them apart? Don't miss the twist that changes everything. This is just the beginning. Where will you be when the truth comes crashing down? Caleb Whitaker stood at the head of the table, his sharp suit cutting through the soft, warm light of the upscale restaurant. His colleagues surrounded him, hanging on every word, as he recounted his latest successful venture. A self-assured smirk tugged at his lips, the kind of confidence that came only with a man who had built an empire from scratch. He'd always believed that wealth was the ultimate measure of success, and to him, it felt like every moment was an opportunity to prove that. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice steady, "when you're as driven as I am, nothing is impossible. Money, power, these things are earned, not given. Every dollar, every connection I've made is the result of hard work. There's no luck involved." The group nodded, murmuring in agreement. Caleb could see the admiration in their eyes. He reveled in it, knowing he was the center of their world. But across the table, Nate Whitaker, his younger brother, didn't seem impressed. "Is that so?" Nate's voice broke the moment of silence. Caleb looked up, eyebrow raised in mock challenge. "Yes, that's so," Caleb responded, leaning back in his chair. "Why?" "Well then, prove it," Nate said with a sly grin. The room grew quiet, the challenge hanging thick in the air. Caleb chuckled, leaning forward. "What do you mean, prove it? I've already done that." Nate shrugged casually. "No, I mean really prove it. Live with someone who has nothing to offer you, nothing you can gain from. Someone completely outside your world. For 6 months, show us how well you can thrive when you're not surrounded by your usual circle of yes men and money." Caleb's eyes narrowed, but the arrogance in him flared. "That's ridiculous. What good would that do me?" "Maybe it'll teach you something," Nate replied, his tone playful yet serious. "Maybe you'll learn what real work, real connection really feels like when there's no money on the table." A laugh escaped Caleb's lips. "You think I can't handle it?" His challenge was met with a quiet murmur from the group. Caleb's confidence was overwhelming, but Nate didn't flinch. "I'm betting you can't," Nate said, his smile turning wry. "And the bet's on. You'll have to spend 6 months living with someone from a completely different world. No money, no help from your connections. You'll have to survive and live as they do. Prove that you can succeed without the privileges you've had your whole life." The words hit Caleb like a sharp blow. His life had been nothing but wealth, power, and comfort, a life of control. He wasn't sure what Nate was trying to prove, but Caleb's ego wouldn't let him back down. "Fine," Caleb said, his voice hard. "You want me to live with someone from another world? I'll do it." A hush fell over the room. Caleb glanced at the group. His colleagues exchanged knowing looks, but no one said a word. It was settled. Nate's grin widened, knowing he had Caleb's pride hooked. The next morning, Caleb received the shocking news. His brother wasn't just talking about anyone. The person he'd be living with was Joelle Marlowe, a plus-sized art teacher from a modest background, struggling to keep her community art center afloat. She had no wealth, no connections, just her art and a deep, unshakable passion. Caleb wasn't prepared for this. The thought of living with someone like Joelle, someone from a world so far removed from his own, made his stomach turn. But his pride demanded that he go through with it. This wasn't just a bet anymore. This was a challenge to everything Caleb believed, and it would begin with the woman who had nothing to offer except her art. Caleb stepped into Joelle's world with a sense of superiority that quickly began to crumble. The small house was cluttered with art supplies, half-finished sculptures, and scattered canvases. It smelled of clay and paint, an earthy scent that contrasted sharply with the clean, sterile environment of his own home. He wrinkled his nose slightly, adjusting his tie, trying to hide his discomfort. This was not the luxury he was used to. He was out of place. Joelle stood by the door, arms crossed, her eyes scanning him with a mixture of curiosity and challenge. "So you're here," she said, her tone neutral but firm. She wasn't impressed by his expensive suit or polished appearance. Caleb cleared his throat. "I'm not here for long, just 6 months, as per the bet." His voice was clipped, the words a little too sharp, as if he still thought he could control everything around him. Joelle didn't respond immediately. She just nodded and turned to walk into the house, her footsteps light but purposeful. Caleb followed her inside, glancing around with a mixture of judgment and curiosity. He had imagined it would be bad, but not quite like this. The modest furnishings, the old wood floors, and the overabundance of art supplies, it was all so foreign to him. "So what's the plan?" Caleb asked, his voice colder now. "You got a job for me? Some task I can do around here?" Joelle turned and raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" she asked, genuinely puzzled. "You think you're here to work for me?" She scoffed, a laugh escaping her lips. "You can start by not looking down at me or my house." Caleb stood there for a moment, taken aback by her bluntness. "I didn't—" "Yes, you did," Joelle interrupted, stepping closer. "I'm not your project, Caleb. I don't need saving. I didn't ask for this. But we'll make do, and we'll make it work." Her voice wasn't loud, but it had a certain edge that silenced him. For a brief moment, Caleb felt a flicker of doubt. He wasn't used to being spoken to like this. Back in his world, people deferred to him, whether out of respect or fear. Joelle wasn't afraid, and she certainly didn't respect him in the way he expected. "Right," Caleb muttered, trying to regain his composure. He was here on a bet, but now that he was actually in her space, something about it felt uncomfortable. He wasn't sure what to make of her. As the days passed, Caleb's discomfort only grew. Joelle had no interest in entertaining his high-maintenance ways. He found himself cooking his own meals, making his own coffee, and even doing chores he would have hired someone else to do in the past. It wasn't hard, but it was a sharp contrast to his usual pampered lifestyle. Joelle watched him with quiet amusement as he fumbled through the tasks. She made no effort to hide her disdain when he tried to take charge in her space. "This isn't how we do things here," she would say, her tone dry when he tried to organize things properly. Her sarcastic remarks cut deeper than he expected. One evening, after Caleb had dropped a cup of coffee on the floor while trying to balance too many things, Joelle finally lost her patience. "Seriously? You can't even manage a cup of coffee?" she said, exasperated. "I'm trying," Caleb snapped, frustration bubbling up. "It's not like I live in a house like this every day." "And you don't have to," Joelle shot back. "But maybe it wouldn't kill you to learn a little about living." The air between them grew tense, and for the first time in a long while, Caleb felt completely helpless. There was no wealth or power he could rely on here. There were no assistants to clean up his mess, no one to smooth over his mistakes. Joelle's world didn't care about his money or status. Later that night, as he lay in bed, Caleb couldn't shake the image of Joelle's eyes, her unwavering confidence. He was used to being the one people admired, the one everyone thought had it all together. But here, in Joelle's world, he was just another person trying to fit in. He turned over, his mind racing. This was supposed to be a bet, a simple challenge. But now it felt more like a test, and it wasn't just about surviving in her world. It was about him facing parts of himself he'd always avoided. Caleb was used to controlling the narrative, but Joelle had shattered that illusion with nothing more than a few simple words, and he wasn't sure how to handle it. Caleb stared at the worn, leather-bound book in his hands, the faint scent of dust rising as he opened it. It wasn't the kind of thing he would normally touch, let alone read. He was more accustomed to business reports, emails, and the occasional novel for leisure. But there, buried in the attic of Joelle's house, was an old box filled with papers that somehow called out to him. The box was unassuming, nothing remarkable about it. But it held something that caught Caleb's attention, his late mother's journal. Flipping through the pages, Caleb's fingers hesitated as they brushed over the delicate paper. His mother had always been a mystery to him, a woman of quiet strength who had poured herself into her family but never let anyone truly see her. She died when Caleb was in his late teens, leaving behind a legacy of wealth and a life filled with expectations. But now, as Caleb read through her words, a different side of her began to emerge. one that seemed to have been hidden from him for years. Her handwriting was elegant, flowing with a soft grace that reminded Caleb of the soft-spoken woman who had raised him. But as he read, he found something unexpected. His mother had once dreamed of being an artist. She had written of her passion for sculpture, her desire to create art that moved people, just as Joelle did with her own work. Caleb couldn't help but wonder why she had never pursued her dreams. Why had she chosen the life of a wealthy businesswoman instead? A wave of guilt washed over him as he continued reading. His mother's words were filled with regret, her inability to follow her true calling clear in every sentence. She had written about the constant pressure of maintaining appearances, of having to live up to the expectations placed on her as a successful woman in a man's world. It was clear that, like Caleb, she had been trapped by the very wealth and success that had defined her life. As the pages turned, Caleb's heart clenched. His mother had written about a mentor, an artist who had shown her the world of sculpture, encouraging her to pursue her dreams. That mentor's name caught Caleb's attention. Joelle Marlowe, the same name as the woman he was living with. The realization hit Caleb like a ton of bricks. Joelle's mentor was his mother's mentor. The two women had shared a bond, a shared passion for art, and Caleb had never known. It was a connection that seemed almost fated. He couldn't understand why his mother had never mentioned it, why she had hidden this part of her life from him. He sat back, stunned. Joelle's world, her art, the very thing that had drawn him to her in the first place, was now tangled with his mother's forgotten dreams. He had never considered that Joelle's passion for her craft might be more than just an escape. It was a reflection of something deeper, something that connected her to his own past in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. Joelle walked into the room just then, her soft footsteps cutting through the silence. Caleb didn't look up immediately, but his mind was racing. He felt a strange sense of connection to her, a bond that went beyond the surface. Joelle had no idea that her mentor was the same person who had shaped his mother's life in ways he couldn't yet grasp. "Are you all right?" Joelle's voice broke through his thoughts, and Caleb looked up. Her face was unreadable, but there was a flicker of concern in her eyes. Caleb hesitated for a moment, the journal still in his hands. "I didn't know," he said quietly, his voice softer than usual. "I didn't know she had dreams like this. She never talked about it." Joelle's expression softened, and she sat down across from him. "People hide things for all sorts of reasons," she said gently. "Sometimes it's not just about who they are, but what the world expects them to be." Caleb's chest tightened as he thought about his mother, about all the things he never knew. He realized for the first time that maybe he had been living the same lie, chasing after wealth, success, and admiration without ever truly understanding what mattered. "I think I've been living like her," Caleb said, his voice low. "Chasing things that don't make me happy, things I don't even want." Joelle met his gaze, her eyes steady. "Then it's not too late to change that, Caleb." For the first time since he'd arrived, Caleb didn't feel the weight of his wealth pressing down on him. Instead, he felt a flicker of something else. Hope, perhaps. A chance for redemption, not just for his mother, but for himself. The gala was everything Caleb had imagined, a glittering display of wealth, power, and status. The room was filled with polished smiles, crisp tuxedos, and gowns that shimmered under the soft lights. Conversations hummed around him, but Caleb stood apart, a towering figure of wealth, observing from the sidelines. Joelle, on the other hand, looked slightly out of place. She had been hesitant at first, reluctant to mingle with the high society crowd, but Caleb insisted. This was part of the bet, after all. He had promised to support her art, and this event was the perfect opportunity to introduce her to potential donors. She wore a simple black dress, elegant but understated, her hair styled in soft waves. To Caleb, she looked radiant. But it wasn't long before he noticed the subtle but sharp glances from the other guests. The moment she entered the ballroom, a few people turned their heads. Some smiled politely, while others whispered behind their glasses. Caleb's stomach twisted. It was the same old game. Joelle didn't belong in this world and everyone could see it. The first insult came from a well-dressed woman with perfectly coiffed hair and an exaggerated laugh. "Oh, what a lovely piece of art," she said, gesturing to Joelle's modest sculpture displayed at the event. "I didn't know they'd let people like her in the same room as us." Joelle froze. Her smile, previously warm and welcoming, faltered, but she held her ground. Caleb wanted to step in to call her out on her cruelty, but he didn't. He didn't want to cause a scene. Not here. His eyes briefly met Joelle's, and for the first time he saw something unfamiliar in her: vulnerability. She was a woman used to being overlooked, but that didn't make it any less painful. The night went on, and the comments came in waves. Some were subtle, others not so much. Every time someone sneered or made a condescending remark, Caleb felt himself shrink just a little bit more. He tried to brush it off, but the weight of it all began to press on him. Joelle, on the other hand, didn't flinch. She kept her composure, but Caleb could see it in her eyes. The hurt, the exhaustion. The final straw came when they were standing near a group of people discussing art. One man, a well-known critic, turned to Joelle, his gaze dismissive. "Your work is nice," he said, "but it doesn't have the same impact, you know? Maybe you should try something more modern, something that's, well, more appealing to the market." The words hit Joelle like a punch to the gut. She tried to smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. Caleb could see her jaw tighten, the unspoken pain lurking just beneath the surface. Before he could step in, she turned on her heel and walked away, her face a mask of controlled emotions. "Joelle, wait!" Caleb called, his voice rising above the chatter. He rushed after her, his heart pounding. Joelle was standing by the window, her back to him, looking out over the city. She was trying to keep it together, but Caleb could see the tears threatening to fall. "Joelle," he repeated, softer this time as he reached her side. "I'm sorry. I should have said something." She shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "Don't apologize for me, Caleb. They don't see me for who I am. They see me for what they want to see." He wanted to say more, to explain that it wasn't right, that people should be judged for their worth, not their appearance. But what was the point? She already knew. She had lived with that judgment for years. He, on the other hand, had never had to face such ridicule. His wealth, his status, had always protected him from the harshness of the world. "You're more than they'll ever know," he said, his voice quiet. "You don't need their approval." Joelle turned to him then, her eyes filled with a mixture of hurt and defiance. "I don't need their approval, Caleb, but what I need is for you to see me. Not as a project, not as some token to prove a point. See me as a person." The words hit Caleb like a jolt of electricity. He had never really seen her, not like that. He had seen the artist, the woman who was strong and capable. But he hadn't truly seen the pain in her eyes, the weight of her past, the burden she carried. The silence stretched between them, thick and uncomfortable, as Caleb tried to find the right words, but nothing seemed to suffice. "Let's go home," Joelle said quietly, turning away. "This is a waste of time." Caleb stood there for a moment, the weight of her words sinking in. He had wanted to prove something, to himself, to others. But what had he really proven? That he could get by without understanding? That he could hide behind his wealth and status? Joelle was right. He hadn't seen her, not truly. But now, standing in the silence of that moment, Caleb realized that he was starting to see more than he had ever cared to before. The morning after the gala was a quiet one. Caleb had tried to push the memory of the night away, but it lingered like a bad taste in his mouth. He knew Joelle had been hurt, but it wasn't until he was alone in the silence of her home that he truly understood how deep her wounds ran. She had taken it all in stride, kept her composure, but he had seen the cracks. The pain behind her eyes had haunted him ever since. Today, there was no time for reflection. Joelle had entered her latest sculpture in a local competition, one that could bring much-needed attention to her community center and perhaps even secure future funding. It was important, crucial in fact, and Joelle had poured herself into it more than ever before. Caleb, despite his initial reluctance, had promised to help, and now he found himself in her world, watching her work with a growing sense of admiration. She was in the garage-turned-studio, surrounded by towering figures of marble, clay, and steel. There was something hypnotic about the way she worked, her hands, delicate yet sure, shaping her creations with focused precision. Caleb stood in the doorway, watching her from a distance. The room smelled of dust and something earthy, raw. It was a world of creation, of vulnerability, and Caleb could see the depth of her soul in each stroke of her chisel. "Looks good," he said, his voice low, almost hesitant. Joelle didn't look up. She was used to working alone, immersed in her thoughts, and for a moment, Caleb just watched her. But as the minutes passed, he could feel a strange unease building in his chest, a sense that something wasn't quite right. "Are you okay?" he asked, stepping closer. "You've been working for hours without a break." Joelle paused, wiping her hands on a cloth before looking up at him. Her expression was unreadable. "I'm fine. Just need to finish this," she said, her voice steady but tinged with something Caleb couldn't quite place. "It's important." Caleb nodded, not wanting to push her further, but there was an unspoken tension between them, a distance that had started to grow. He had promised to help, but all he had done so far was stand back and watch. He wanted to do more, to show her that he truly understood what this meant to her. But he didn't know how. The phone ringing interrupted the quiet. Joelle glanced at it, then at Caleb. "It's my rival," she muttered, almost as if she were preparing for something unpleasant. "Rival?" Caleb asked, raising an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "An artist. Someone who's always tried to undermine me. She doesn't like that I'm getting attention with this piece," Joelle said bitterly. "She'll try to tear it down in any way she can." Caleb didn't fully understand the dynamics of the art world, but he knew enough to sense the tension in Joelle's voice. He didn't like the idea of anyone hurting her, especially over something as meaningful as her art. Joelle picked up the phone, her expression hardening. Caleb could hear the faint voice of the other artist on the line, though the words were too muffled to make out. Joelle's grip tightened around the phone, her jaw clenching. "I'll deal with this," she said, her tone colder now. "It's just another game she's playing." But Caleb could see the strain in her eyes. He knew this wasn't just about the competition anymore. This was personal. After Joelle hung up, she turned to Caleb, her expression resolute but weary. "It's happening again. She's going to sabotage me, Caleb. She'll do whatever it takes to ruin this for me." Caleb's stomach twisted. He had seen this before. People tearing each other down to climb higher. He had been part of that world. But now, in this moment, he saw something different. He saw Joelle's strength, her vulnerability, and he couldn't stand the thought of anyone hurting her. "I won't let her get away with this," Caleb said firmly, his voice hardening with resolve. "We'll make sure she can't touch your work." Joelle stared at him, surprised by the intensity in his voice. "You don't understand," she said quietly. "This isn't just about the art. It's about my entire life, everything I've worked for. It's not just a painting or a sculpture, it's my heart." Caleb was taken aback by the raw emotion in her words. This was more than a competition for Joelle. This was her way of showing the world who she was, of standing up for herself. And someone was trying to tear it all down. He stepped closer, his voice low but resolute. "I understand more than you think. I've been living in a world where everything was easy, where everything was handed to me. But this is real. And I won't stand by while someone tries to take it away from you." Joelle looked up at him, the walls she had built around herself softening for a moment. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly, though her voice betrayed the slightest tremor. "I want to," Caleb said, his eyes locked on hers. "I want to help you, Joelle." The tension in the room was palpable, but it was different now. Caleb wasn't just a man standing on the sidelines anymore. He was with her, in this moment ready to fight for her, and for something that mattered more than either of them had realized. Caleb sat at his desk, the weight of his phone call still heavy in the air. The words from his business partner, Lillian Brooks, echoed in his mind, each syllable a reminder of his failure. The deal that had been months in the making, the one that could have solidified his position as a dominant force in the industry, had fallen apart. The reason? A breach of trust. Caleb's own partner had been caught in a series of shady dealings, and the scandal had erupted, taking Caleb's reputation with it. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers running through his hair in frustration. He had always known the business world was cutthroat, but this was personal. His entire career, everything he had worked for, seemed to be slipping through his fingers. And the worst part was that he had no one to blame but himself. Nate had warned him. Joelle had warned him. But he had been too blinded by his own ambitions, too focused on climbing higher to see the cracks forming beneath him. Now, standing on the edge of a professional collapse, Caleb found himself at a crossroads. He reached for the glass of whiskey on his desk, the familiar burn of alcohol offering little comfort. His mind drifted to Joelle. He had promised her that he would help her with her art center, but now it seemed like everything was falling apart. He had no idea what to do anymore, where to go, or how to fix the mess he had made of his own life. The door to his office creaked open, and Nate stepped in without knocking, his face stern. "You heard from Lillian, huh?" Caleb didn't respond immediately. He didn't have the words. Instead, he just nodded, his gaze fixed on the glass in his hand. "You've got to fix this, Caleb," Nate said, his tone low but urgent. "You've got to fix your own mess before it's too late, or else everything you've built, everything you've been pretending to be, will come crashing down." Caleb's grip tightened on the glass, his fingers trembling slightly. Nate's words hit him harder than he expected. He had been pretending, hadn't he? Pretending that the money, the power, the success were all that mattered. Pretending that his worth was defined by the numbers in his bank account. But now, he was seeing the cracks in the facade. He had been so focused on the wrong things that he hadn't even realized the damage he was doing to himself and to others. "I don't know how to fix this," Caleb admitted, his voice rough. He set the glass down, suddenly feeling too exhausted to care about appearances. "I don't even know who I am anymore, Nate." Nate studied him for a moment, then sighed and walked over to Caleb's desk. "You don't have to do this alone, you know. Joelle's right there. You've been so caught up in everything you think you're supposed to be that you've ignored the only thing that really matters, who you really are." Caleb ran a hand over his face, trying to process Nate's words. Joelle. Her face flashed in his mind, and for a brief moment he felt a strange sense of clarity. She had shown him what real strength looked like. She had faced so much in her life, yet she never lost sight of what was truly important to her. Art, passion, purpose. "I've been so blind," Caleb murmured, more to himself than to Nate. "Yeah," Nate said, a slight smile tugging at his lips. "You've been chasing something that wasn't even real. It's time you wake up." Caleb stood up, his legs shaky but determined. "I need to make things right. I need to fix this. I can't keep pretending like everything's fine." "You don't have to do it alone, Caleb," Nate reminded him. "But you have to start by being honest with yourself. Start by fixing the things that matter." Caleb nodded, his resolve solidifying. He had been running from his own truth for too long. Now he was ready to face it. No more hiding behind his wealth, no more distractions. It was time to rebuild, to face the mess he had created, and to start over. Caleb walked out of his office, a new sense of purpose in his step. The world outside seemed a little less intimidating now, a little less unforgiving. He still had a long way to go, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was heading in the right direction. And it wasn't about money. It wasn't about status. It was about doing what was right, and maybe, just maybe, he could find redemption in that. Caleb spent the rest of the day in a daze, trying to focus on the mess that was his career, but unable to shake the feeling of disconnection that had settled in his chest. His brother Nate had told him that to fix things, he first needed to look inward, to face the truth about who he was and where he'd come from. Caleb knew Nate was right, but he wasn't sure where to start. That evening, after a long day of failed calls and business deals falling apart, Caleb found himself back at Joelle's house. He wasn't sure why he came. Maybe because she had been the only person who truly understood what it was like to have everything and still feel empty. Or maybe he just needed to feel something real, something that wasn't tied to money or status. Joelle was in her studio again, surrounded by the work she'd poured her soul into. Her sculptures, once so distant and foreign to Caleb, now seemed to speak to him, as if they were telling him a story he didn't quite understand yet. She looked up when he entered, offering him a small smile. But there was something different about the way she looked at him now, less guarded, like she was finally seeing him for who he was. "Is everything okay?" Joelle asked, wiping her hands on a cloth. Her voice was soft, but there was concern there too. Caleb hesitated. He wasn't used to talking about himself, to admitting his flaws, his insecurities. He'd always believed that showing vulnerability was a weakness. But tonight, something had changed in him. "No," he admitted. "It's not." Joelle didn't say anything, just gestured for him to sit down. Caleb sank into a chair, looking around the room. There were sketches on the walls, half-finished sculptures scattered about. This was her world, and for the first time, he was beginning to understand just how much of herself she poured into her art. "I've been going through some old things," Caleb said, his voice quieter now. "I found something I didn't know about my mother." Joelle's eyes flickered with interest, though she said nothing, simply waiting for him to continue. "She used to be an artist," Caleb said, the words feeling strange on his tongue. "I found a journal of hers, hidden away. She had dreams of being a sculptor, like you, but she never pursued it. She gave up on it for the life she thought she had to lead." He paused, his mind swirling with the weight of this new revelation. "She never talked about it. I didn't even know. All these years I thought I was living the life she wanted for me. But now I'm not sure what I've been doing." Joelle watched him closely, her expression softening. "You've been living for someone else's expectations, I get it," she said gently. "It's hard to break away from that. But you don't have to carry that weight anymore, Caleb. You don't have to follow in her footsteps. You have a choice." Her words settled over him like a balm, soothing some of the sting of his own realizations. He had spent his life running from his mother's unfulfilled dreams, trying to prove that he was more than what she had wanted for him. But now, in the quiet of Joelle's studio, he realized that he had never really chosen his own path. He had been following a script written long ago, by his mother, by society, by everyone but himself. "It's just so hard," Caleb admitted, his voice cracking slightly. "I don't know who I am without all of this. The money, the business, the image. Without that, I'm just a guy who doesn't know what he's doing." Joelle stood up, walking over to him. She didn't speak at first, just reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder. Caleb looked up at her, meeting her gaze. In that moment, he saw not just the artist, the woman who had been hurt by the world's judgments, but someone who had learned to find strength in herself despite it all. "You're not alone in this, Caleb," she said softly. "You don't have to have it all figured out. You just have to start somewhere." Her words hit him harder than he expected. She was right. He didn't have to have all the answers right now. He just needed to start somewhere, and maybe that was the most important step of all. For the first time in years, Caleb felt a flicker of hope. He wasn't sure where this new path would take him, or even what it would look like. But he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't keep living the life he had been. It was time to make a change. Time to break free from the expectations and the masks he had been hiding behind for so long. "Thank you," Caleb whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "for helping me see that." Joelle gave him a soft smile, her eyes filled with understanding. "It's the least I could do. Now let's focus on what matters. What you want, Caleb." And in that moment, Caleb realized that it was no longer just about him. It was about the choices he would make, the person he would become, and the future he would build, for himself and for the people who mattered. Caleb had been avoiding the inevitable for weeks now. He knew this moment was coming, but he hadn't prepared for it. Vivian, Joelle's best friend, was standing in front of him, her arms crossed and her eyes narrowed with a mix of concern and frustration. "Caleb, we need to talk," she said, her voice firm. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know what you're going to say. I've heard it from everyone else already." Vivian's gaze didn't soften. "Do you? Because I don't think you do. You've been playing games with Joelle, and I don't think it's fair to her. Caleb felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He hadn't expected Vivian to be so blunt, but there was a part of him that knew he deserved it. After all, he hadn't exactly been honest with Joelle about his feelings or his intentions. "What do you want me to say, Vivian?" Caleb's voice was quieter now, his usual confidence wavering under the weight of her piercing stare. "I'm not pretending anymore. I'm trying to do better. Trying to make things right." "Trying?" Vivian scoffed. "Is that what you're calling it? You've been dragging your feet this whole time, Caleb. You've been living in her house, but you've been barely there. You're still treating her like some project, something you can fix, not someone who matters to you." Caleb flinched at her words. She was right. He had been distant, unsure of himself. He had thought he could help Joelle, but instead, he had ended up confusing both of them. It wasn't enough to just try anymore. He had to be all in. "I'm here, Vivian," he said, his voice almost pleading. "I'm here now, and I'm trying to make things right. I care about her, I do, but I don't know how to do this, how to be what she needs me to be." Vivian softened slightly but didn't let up. "You're not being honest with yourself, Caleb. You're scared. You're scared of what it means to let go of the life you've built, to stop pretending that money and power mean something." Caleb's chest tightened. He hadn't realized just how much fear was still controlling him. He had been so caught up in his past, in his need to be someone else, that he hadn't even seen the real Joelle, or the real Caleb for that matter. "I'm not pretending anymore," he said, the words coming out more forcefully this time. "I know what I've done, but I'm done hiding. I'm done being someone I'm not." Vivian watched him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then, with a heavy sigh, she spoke again. "If you really care about her, Caleb, you need to show her that. She's been hurt by people before, and I'm not going to let you make the same mistakes. You need to prove it to her. You need to stop being afraid of what's real." Caleb felt the weight of her words sink deep into him. He had been afraid for so long, afraid of losing control, afraid of letting go of the persona he had built up. But now, standing here in front of Vivian, he realized that his fear had been holding him back from the only thing that could actually set him free. Honesty. He nodded slowly, his resolve strengthening. "I will, I promise." Vivian finally seemed to soften, the sharpness in her eyes fading. "Good, because Joelle deserves more than half-hearted efforts. She deserves someone who sees her, who values her for who she is, not just as a tool to fix your problems." Caleb was quiet for a moment, the silence between them thick with understanding. He had always been afraid of showing his true self, of being vulnerable. But now, he knew it was time to face his fears, to let go of the past and move forward, for Joelle, for himself. "I'll make it right," Caleb said, his voice steady now. "I'll show her. I won't mess this up." Vivian gave him a final long look before turning to leave. "You better, because if you hurt her, you won't have to worry about losing her. You'll lose yourself in the process." The words lingered in the air, and Caleb stood there feeling the full weight of them. This was it, the moment of truth. No more games, no more hiding. It was time to stop being afraid of the future and take control of the present. And as he walked toward the door, his heart pounding with the realization of what he had to do next, he knew one thing for sure. This time, he was all in. The night of the competition had arrived, and the gallery was filled with excitement. It was a prestigious event, the kind that could make or break an artist's career. Joelle's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the final touches on her sculpture, a piece that had consumed her for weeks. Every detail had to be perfect. This wasn't just about winning. This was about proving herself to the world. Caleb stood by her side, his presence a quiet anchor in the storm of nervous energy that surrounded them. The room buzzed with the hum of eager guests, curators, and critics, all admiring the works of art displayed around the gallery. But Caleb's focus was on Joelle, on her art, her journey, and how far she had come. She had been so focused on making her mark, on leaving behind the judgment of others. And now, here she was, standing proudly in front of her creation. "You okay?" Caleb asked softly, his voice barely rising above the hum of the crowd. Joelle looked up at him, her face a mixture of nerves and determination. "I don't know," she confessed. "I've never felt this exposed." Caleb could understand that feeling. He had spent so much of his life hiding behind the mask of success, behind his wealth and reputation. But Joelle had always been real. She had never hidden who she was, even when the world didn't understand her. "You've got this," Caleb said, his tone firm but warm. "You've always had this." She nodded, her eyes still fixed on the sculpture. It was more than just a piece of art. It was a piece of her heart, molded into something tangible. The work spoke of loss and growth, of pain and triumph. It was the culmination of everything she had been through. And now, it was her time to shine. As the night progressed, Joelle's work garnered attention. People whispered in hushed tones about the raw emotion captured in the sculpture, the way it seemed to breathe with life, to tell a story that was impossible to ignore. Caleb watched, amazed, as the critics who had once dismissed Joelle's work began to circle, their eyes now filled with admiration. But just as the evening seemed to be turning in Joelle's favor, disaster struck. A figure emerged from the crowd, a familiar face, one Caleb had hoped to avoid. It was Lillian Brooks, a rival artist who had long been a thorn in Joelle's side. Lillian's reputation was built on elitism, on carefully curated art that spoke to the highest bidder. But tonight, she was on the offensive, and Caleb could see the glint of jealousy in her eyes as she approached Joelle's sculpture. Lillian didn't even attempt to be subtle. She was blunt, as always. "This isn't what the market wants," she said loudly, drawing the attention of several guests around them. "It's too personal, too raw. People want art they can hang on their walls, not something that makes them feel." The words landed like a slap, and Joelle's face fell. Caleb could see the hurt flash across her eyes, but she didn't let it show for long. She stood her ground, lifting her chin slightly. "You don't get it," Joelle replied, her voice steady despite the sting of Lillian's words. "Art is meant to make people feel. If it doesn't, then it's just decoration." Lillian scoffed, but Caleb could feel the tension building. This wasn't just a competition anymore. This was about respect, about standing up for everything Joelle had worked for. And Caleb wasn't going to let Lillian undermine her anymore. Before Lillian could respond, Caleb stepped forward. "You don't get to talk down to her like that," he said, his voice firm, unyielding. "Joelle's art speaks for itself. You might not understand it, but that doesn't make it any less valuable." Lillian's eyes narrowed, a sneer forming on her lips. "You think this is about respect? This is about winning, Caleb. And your little project here," she gestured to Joelle's sculpture with a dismissive wave, "isn't going to win." Joelle's face tightened, but Caleb could see the fire in her eyes. This was her moment. She wasn't going to let Lillian or anyone else tell her that her work wasn't enough. Before Caleb could respond, Joelle stepped in front of him, facing Lillian directly. "You're right," she said, her voice ringing clear and strong. "This isn't about winning. It's about making something that matters, something that's real, and I'm proud of that." There was a moment of silence, and then the crowd around them began to murmur, their attention now fully focused on Joelle. Caleb stood beside her, feeling a rush of pride for the woman who had faced everything with so much courage, who had finally claimed her space in a world that had tried to push her down. Lillian, realizing she had lost the crowd, gave a sharp, frustrated huff and stalked off, leaving Joelle and Caleb in the center of the gallery. The tension melted and the room seemed to breathe again. "Thank you," Joelle whispered, turning to Caleb with a soft smile. "I didn't expect you to stand up for me like that." Caleb smiled back, his heart lighter than it had been in weeks. "I'm not going anywhere. Not this time." And just like that, Caleb realized something he hadn't fully understood until this moment. He had always been running from the world, from his own insecurities. But now, standing beside Joelle, he wasn't just standing with her. He was standing for her. And for the first time in his life, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. The weeks following the gallery event had been a blur. Caleb had thrown himself into repairing the damage to his career, but his mind was never far from Joelle. They had grown closer, a bond that seemed to deepen every time they were together. The walls that once stood between them were slowly coming down, and Caleb found himself opening up in ways he never thought possible. But just as he felt he was finally finding his place, The ground beneath him shifted once again. It was a quiet evening when the betrayal happened. Caleb had been at his office finalizing some business contracts when his phone buzzed with a message. He glanced at the screen, his stomach tightening as he saw the sender. Lillian Brooks. He had hoped he was done with her, but the reality was far different. The message read, "You're making a mistake, Caleb. You're getting in too deep with her. She's using you, just like everyone else. The truth will come out, and it won't be pretty." He felt a chill run down his spine as he read those words again. Lillian. The woman who had been an obstacle in his life for as long as he could remember. But this message was different. It wasn't just a warning, it was a threat, wrapped in lies. Caleb's mind raced. How could Lillian know anything about Joelle? He had never discussed her with anyone, let alone someone like Lillian, who had always been more interested in maintaining her high-status reputation than understanding anything beyond that. His heart beat faster as the weight of the situation hit him. He knew Lillian well enough to understand that this wasn't just idle gossip. If she was reaching out to him now, it meant she had something to hide, something that could destroy what Joelle had worked so hard to build. Caleb immediately called Joelle. The phone rang several times before it went to voicemail. He left a message, his voice tense. "Joelle, it's Caleb. I need to talk to you. Please call me as soon as you can." The next few hours were excruciating. Caleb couldn't focus on anything. He paced in his office, the message from Lillian replaying over and over in his head. What was she planning? What was she trying to do? He couldn't shake the feeling that this was all part of a larger scheme to sabotage everything Joelle had worked for. Finally, Joelle returned his call. "What's going on, Caleb?" she asked, her voice cautious, tinged with the anxiety he had come to recognize in her when she sensed something was wrong. "I need you to listen carefully," Caleb said, his voice strained. "Lillian's behind this. She's trying to hurt you. She's been spreading lies about your work, trying to manipulate everything." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Caleb could hear her breathing, steady and calm, but he knew Joelle well enough to understand the panic underneath her composed exterior. "What do you mean, spreading lies?" she finally asked, her tone wary. "She's sending messages, Joelle, to me, telling me you're just using me, that this whole thing is a game to you. She's trying to turn me against you," Caleb confessed, his voice cracking slightly as the weight of the betrayal settled in. Joelle was silent for a moment, and then he heard her voice, quiet and measured. "I should have known." "What do you mean?" Caleb asked, confused. He hadn't expected her to sound so resigned. "I've been waiting for this," she said. "I knew someone would try to tear us apart. I've seen it happen to so many artists. The moment they see someone with potential, someone who's actually real, they go after them. They'll do anything to take that down, to stop the truth from being heard." Her words hit him harder than he expected. The rawness in her voice, the pain that was so familiar to him now, was like a knife to his heart. "I don't want you to believe her," Joelle continued. "You have to know, Caleb, that I'm not using you. I never have been. I don't need your money, your power, or your connections. What I need is for people to see me for what I am, a person, not a project, a woman who's fought for everything she's achieved." Caleb felt a deep pang of guilt. He had always underestimated her strength, her resilience. She had trusted him, believed in him, and here he was, letting someone like Lillian tear them apart with lies. "I believe you," Caleb said, his voice firm with conviction. "And I'm going to make this right. I won't let her destroy everything you've worked for." Joelle's voice softened, though there was still an edge of weariness. "I don't want you to fight for me, Caleb. I just need you to trust me." He paused for a moment, his heart racing with the truth of what she was saying. This wasn't just about fighting off Lillian's lies. It was about something deeper. It was about the trust between them, the connection they had slowly built. And that was something Caleb wasn't willing to lose. "I trust you," he said, his voice steady. "I won't let her get away with this. I'll make sure she knows who's really in control." As the call ended, Caleb stood still, the weight of the situation settling heavily in his chest. He had faced many challenges in his life, but this was different. This wasn't about business or wealth. This was about something real, and he was ready to fight for it. The sun was just beginning to set as Caleb stood in front of the sprawling mansion, feeling the weight of the moment press down on him. He had spent the past few weeks wrestling with his own fears, doubts, and guilt, but today he was done running. Today was the day he would show Joelle how much she truly meant to him, and how far he was willing to go to make things right. Joelle had been hesitant when Caleb first suggested this, an art center, a place for artists like her, who had always been overlooked by the mainstream art world, a space where they could be seen, heard, and appreciated for their true worth. He had told her it was time to make a grand gesture, to prove not just to the world but to themselves that they were worthy of more than just the scraps that others were willing to throw at them. But what Caleb had come to realize over the past few weeks wasn't just that Joelle was worthy of something grand, it was that he was too. He had spent so much of his life focused on external validation, on what people thought of him, that he hadn't taken the time to see what truly mattered. And now, standing here, ready to give Joelle something she had dreamed of, something that would change her life, Caleb knew that this was his own way of starting over. The door to the mansion creaked open, and Joelle stepped outside, her face lit with a mixture of curiosity and hesitation. She was beautiful, of course, her eyes still carrying the weight of everything she'd been through, but now there was a glimmer of something else, something Caleb couldn't quite place. Maybe hope. "Caleb?" she asked softly, stepping closer. "What is this?" Caleb swallowed, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it, the moment he would either prove to her that he had learned or fail once again. But this time there was no turning back. He reached out, taking her hand gently in his. "Joelle, I've spent my entire life trying to build something that wasn't real. I thought money and power were the things that would make me happy, but they never did. And when I met you, I realized that all the things I thought mattered didn't even compare to what's real. What's real is you, your art, your passion for what you do. And I'm sorry for not seeing that sooner." Joelle's eyes softened, but she remained quiet, listening as Caleb continued. "I've built a lot of things in my life, but this is different. I've created something that's not for me, not for anyone else, but for you, for your art. For the people like you who deserve to be seen, who deserve to have a place to show their work, and I'm hoping you'll accept it." He motioned to the large building behind him, a structure that had been under construction for weeks now, a building that was more than just bricks and mortar. It was a community center for artists, a place where they could come together, share their work, and create something real. It was a place where Joelle's art could be seen, where she could inspire others the way she had inspired him. Joelle's eyes widened as she took in the sight, her breath catching in her throat. "Caleb, I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've spent so much of my life trying to be something I'm not, Joelle. But with you, I feel like I'm finally finding the person I was meant to be. And I want to be that person for you. I want to be there for you, to support you. Not because I feel obligated, but because I believe in you." The silence between them hung heavy for a moment, and then Joelle took a deep breath, her voice barely above a whisper. "You've always believed in me, Caleb. But I never thought I'd see something like this. I didn't think I deserved it." "You deserve it more than anyone," Caleb said, squeezing her hand. "You fought for everything you've gotten, and now it's time for you to have a place where you can create without limits." Joelle blinked, tears welling in her eyes. She tried to blink them away, but they fell, one after the other, down her cheeks. Caleb didn't hesitate. He stepped closer, wrapping his arms around her as she sank into him, her body trembling. "I don't know if I can ever repay you for this," Joelle whispered, her voice full of emotion. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to thank you enough." "You don't have to," Caleb said softly, brushing a tear from her cheek. "This isn't about repayment. It's about showing you how much I care, how much I believe in what you do." Joelle pulled back slightly, looking up at him with a mixture of awe and gratitude. "This is everything I've ever wanted, Caleb. This is what I've been fighting for." "Then let's fight together," he said, his voice steady and full of conviction. "We've both been running from the things that matter for too long. But now, it's time to stand up and make something real. For both of us." As Joelle looked at him, her expression softened, the walls between them dissolving for good. She took a deep breath, her eyes filled with a mix of love and trust. "I'm ready." Caleb smiled, a true, genuine smile that came from deep within. He had finally found the courage to step into the future he wanted, a future that was built on something real, something that mattered. And with Joelle by his side, he knew they could face whatever came next, together. The night was still, the only sounds coming from the soft rustle of the trees in the distance and the faint hum of the city beyond. Caleb and Joelle stood side by side, the sky overhead painted with stars, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. Caleb hadn't meant for it to happen this way, but standing there with Joelle, something inside him snapped into focus. All the confusion, the doubts, the walls he'd built around himself, they had all dissolved. He had spent years running, hiding behind success and status, but now with Joelle he could see clearly. This was it. This was what he had been searching for. Turning to her, Caleb felt a rush of emotion flood through him. He had never been one for grand gestures, but in this moment he couldn't hold back any longer. Joelle deserved more than what he had given her so far. She deserved the truth that had been hiding inside him all along. "Joelle," he said softly, his voice a little shaky. "I've spent so much of my life afraid of feeling too much, afraid of being vulnerable. I didn't want to admit it, but you've changed me. You've shown me what it means to live without fear. And I know now, standing here with you, that I can't live without you. I don't want to." Joelle looked at him, her eyes wide, her breath caught. He could see the surprise, the vulnerability in her gaze, and he knew that she had never expected this moment. But Caleb wasn't afraid anymore. He wasn't hiding. "I love you, Joelle," Caleb continued, the words coming from the deepest part of him. "I love you for everything you are, the strength you carry, the passion you put into your art, the way you see the world. You're the most real thing I've ever known, and I don't want to lose that. I don't want to lose you." For a moment, Joelle didn't say anything. The silence stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was full of something else, something deep and unspoken that Caleb could feel in every part of him. Then, slowly, Joelle reached out, her hand trembling just slightly as she touched his cheek. "Caleb," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I never thought I could be loved like this. I never thought I could be enough for someone. But you—" She paused, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You've made me believe that maybe I am." Caleb felt a lump form in his throat as he cupped her face in his hands, his thumb gently brushing away the tears that were now spilling down her cheeks. "You're more than enough," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You always have been." Without another word, Joelle pulled him into an embrace, her arms wrapping tightly around him. Caleb held her just as fiercely, feeling the weight of everything they had been through, everything they had fought for, and how far they had come. It wasn't just about the art or the grand gestures. It was about them, about the love they had found in each other after everything. For the first time in his life, Caleb didn't feel the need to hide. He didn't need to be anyone else. He just needed to be himself, with Joelle, and that was enough. "I love you," Joelle repeated, her voice soft against his chest. "I love you too." The words hung in the air, and in that moment Caleb realized that this was what he had been searching for all along. Not success, not power, but love. True love. Love that didn't come with conditions. Love that was earned through honesty, vulnerability, and acceptance. As they pulled away, Caleb looked at Joelle, his heart full. He had found something real, something worth fighting for, and he would never let it go. "We're in this together," he said, his voice steady, his gaze unwavering. "No matter what." Joelle nodded, her eyes bright with hope. "Together," she agreed. And in that moment under the stars, Caleb knew that they had both found their way home. The grand opening of the art center was everything Joelle had dreamed of. The air buzzed with excitement, the gallery filled with people from all walks of life, artists, curators, critics, and families, all gathered together to celebrate something real. Joelle's vision had come to life, a place where artists could express themselves without fear of judgment, a space where their work could be appreciated for what it truly was. As the ribbon was cut and the first guests began to walk in, Caleb stood beside Joelle, his hand resting gently on her back. He couldn't help but smile at the sight of her, her eyes alight with pride and joy. This was her moment, the culmination of years of hard work, of overcoming obstacles, of never giving up on her art. It wasn't just the success of the center that had brought them here. It was the journey they had taken together to get to this point. Joelle turned to him, her face soft and full of gratitude. "I never thought this day would come," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "This is everything I've ever wanted, and it's all because of you." Caleb shook his head, his smile deepening. "No, Joelle, this is all because of you. You've worked so hard for this, and I'm just lucky enough to be here with you. This is your dream, and I'm honored to be a part of it." She leaned into him for a moment, letting the warmth of his presence sink in. The crowd around them was growing, but in that moment it felt like it was just the two of them, standing together in the quiet understanding that they had fought for this. They had earned this moment, together. As the night unfolded, Caleb found himself reflecting on how far they had come. He had come to realize that love wasn't about grand gestures or wealth or status. It was about being there for someone, truly seeing them, and supporting them in their journey. And that was exactly what he had done for Joelle. He had helped her build this, not because he had to, but because he believed in her. And in doing so, he had found himself. He had found a purpose that was greater than his career, greater than the life he had been living. Later in the evening, as the crowd began to thin, Joelle pulled Caleb aside, away from the laughter and chatter that filled the room. She led him to the back of the center where a quiet patio overlooked the city. The moonlight bathed the space in a soft, silvery glow, and for a moment, they stood there in silence, taking it all in. "This is it, Caleb," Joelle said softly, her voice filled with awe. "This is the beginning of something new, something real." Caleb nodded, his heart full as he looked at her. "It's a new chapter, Joelle, for both of us. We've come so far, and now we're finally here." Joelle took a deep breath, turning to face him fully. "You know, I used to think that I wasn't worthy of something like this, that I wasn't enough. But you made me see that I am, that my art, my work, my passion, they're worth something. And it's because of you that I found the courage to believe that." Caleb stepped closer to her, his heart swelling with emotion. "You've always been worthy, Joelle. You just needed someone to remind you. You're stronger than you think. And I've been lucky enough to be by your side to see you grow and shine." Joelle's eyes glistened, and she reached out to take his hand. "I don't know what the future holds, Caleb, but I know that whatever happens, I want to face it with you. I want to create something real, something that matters, together." Caleb squeezed her hand gently, his heart full of promise. Together. In that moment, standing under the stars with Joelle, Caleb felt a peace he had never known. The future was uncertain, but for the first time he wasn't afraid. They had built something real, something lasting, and they were just beginning. There was no more running, no more hiding. This was their time, their moment, and Caleb knew without a doubt that with Joelle by his side, they could face whatever the world threw their way. A new beginning had begun,